All right, guys, we're back on the phone with Greg Grimes. He is the owner of Aquatic Environmental and Lakework.com. He is a fisheries biologist, and today we're going to talk a little bit about, actually, we're going to go quite in depth with the fall turnover, and he's even going to talk about the spring turnover for some of the guys that are up north. We don't see that as much down here in the south, but he's going to talk a little bit about that and how it affects our fishing. Greg, how you doing?
Good, good. How you been, Matt?
Excellent, excellent. So in the fall, the guys get out there, and we know late fall, right before winter, fishing gets great. They're feeding up. They're getting ready for that to go back into their winter haunts. But there's that time, or about right now, between now and October here in the South, and I'm sure it changes no matter throughout the country. We have what's called the turnover, and it affects fishing in a bad, bad way. Tell us a little bit about the turnover and how it might affect our fishing.
Sure. Yeah. Basically, what happens is, water chemistry is very unique in that the water is the most dense at 39 degrees of temperature.
Mm-hmm.
So throughout the year, colder water settles to the bottom, and warmer water stays on top. So you get what most fishermen know as a thermocline. It just gets more and more pushed down throughout the summer months, and so there's absolutely no mixing whatsoever of that bottom water. And so it's a pretty bad environment. I mean,
Right.
and everybody knows that they're a fisherman. You just don't go fishing whatever the depth, usually halfway through the water column. But, 40, 50 foot of depth, there's just no fish living down there in a deep lake. There's no fish living in 20 foot of depth in a fairly smaller body of water.
Mm-hmm.
There's just no oxygen down there, so it's locked in. So what happens is when we start getting some of this cool weather coming in, is that colder water on the surface pushes to the bottom, and then when it breaks that thermocline, you all of a sudden get a flip of all of that water on the bottom. I call it noxious water. It's just there's basically little to no oxygen at all, and that creates a pretty poor environment for fish. And there's a lot of theories as to why the fish don't feed. It's actually kind of funny to me reading all the ones. Basically, they're stressed. They're living in a pretty happy environment, and all of a sudden, and it can be really sudden. Sometimes it's over several weeks or maybe even a month.
Mm-hmm.
But all of a sudden, that environment's changed, and they've got to try to seek out some other habitat to live in due to that lower oxygen event.
Yeah, and that's funny that you say that. Really, any kind of change like that shocks a fish. We see there's several other events that may happen, whether it be a cold front or whatever. That water doesn't necessarily flip exactly. It kind of mixes. Is that correct?
Yeah, it mixes up, and so you've got a lot of what's called detritus, organic matter, sitting down on the bottom, and it's locked in there, and not really a big impact on the fish because they're not living in that environment. All of a sudden, it's mixed up. So you mix that a lot of bad water with a little bit of good water, and the fish are pretty stressed. But of course, in a reservoir setting, I work a lot on ponds, and honestly, I think the other day, because we had some 48-degree temperatures, I was at a pond just yesterday, and the fish were not feeding at all on the fish feeder.
Mm-hmm.
And I think they may have had to turn a really shallow lake, a lot of water that's 4 or 5 foot of depth. So that little bit, I think it just flipped. And we had some, fairly high winds as well, which speeds up the process. But on a reservoir, not the entire lake flips at one time. So I know it's a great excuse for not catching any fish. It's a built-in excuse, and all fishermen need an excuse when they're not biting. But you just need to seek out some other habitat. It's usually going to affect the shallow water quicker, because that colder water can then penetrate a thermocline that's not as deep. So if you got a shallow flat that's 10 foot and you may have that thermocline at 5 foot of depth and you get some cooler temperatures,
Mm-hmm.
it's going to push down pretty easily to flip it. It's not going to be able to flip it down by the dam where that thermocline is at 20, 30, 40 foot of depth.
Right.
So you just need to avoid that area. If you're good at reading electronics, a lot of times you can see that density gradient. Phytoplankton, zooplankton are living there, and you can see that. But you'll see the watercolor change. You may even smell it. But you have to go to different parts of the lake. And,
Right.
A lot of people are even going to go fish rivers this time of year,
Mm-hmm.
or fish the most heavily influenced river part of a lake because it's bringing in fresh oxygen.
Yeah, so lakes, you don't really see this as much as in these river lakes that have current, a lot of current, that flow water each day. Either it helps or it totally does away with the turnover. Is that correct?
That's right. It may never set up summer stratification, so it may never stratify at all. If you've got so much water constantly flushing in there that's fairly cool, you don't have that gradient ever set up. So, of course, you're not going to have a turnover
Mm-hmm.
because you don't have that possibility. And that's what we do with some of our aeration systems and ponds, too, is we keep them destratified the entire time.
Right.
And then what happens, again, going back to how the water's most dense at 39 degrees, if you think about it, you would never have ice on the surface of a lake.
Right.
If it's most dense at 32 degrees, you'd have ice on the bottom of the lake, but we all know ice is at the top.
Right.
So in the spring, to a much smaller degree, you will have a spring turnover as well after ice over. And it's kind of the opposite. As things start to warm up, that water is warmer at the bottom. It pushes down and then flips that water up there when ice is out. So you have a little period of time that's similar to what we have in the fall.
All right, before we go, let's talk a little bit about temperatures. And once again, let's go over what the guys can look for as far as some ideas to say, okay, for sure it's turning over right now.
Discolored water, possibly smelly water, and usually every body of water, like we talked about real quickly, every body of water is different. Usually it's around 60 degrees.
Mm-hmm.
You know, a lot of thermoclines are set up where you're at, you know, most of the summer 80 degrees on the surface and 70, and then you hit that thermocline, it quickly goes from, say, 70 maybe down to like 55 degrees.
Mm-hmm.
So you start getting some surface water temperatures, and you get some air temperatures, say, in the 40s.
Right.
And that surface water temperature drops quickly down to 60, and it's going to push down to the bottom. That's when that's going to take place. So if people start claiming it's, you know, in the South, if they start claiming they're having a turnover right now, that's not what it is. That's just an isolated phytoplankton bloom. You know, there's tons, I mean, thousands of algal species.
Mm-hmm.
Some like cooler temperatures.
Yeah.
So the cooler temperatures that cause some of this algae to grow, and that may be what they're seeing, not actually the turnover at this point.
So, yeah, just an algae bloom is usually, like right now, I see guys talk about it in the 70s, you know, here in the South. That's probably not occurring when the water temp's in the 70s. Typically, you say it's when the water temp gets around 60s when we start to see that, right?
55 to 60, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and you know, we work fish kills if it happens too quickly, but again, it's overtime. You may have a small little turnover, and then it kind of stabilizes itself again, and then you get 3 or 4 really cold temperature days in the 40s. That's when it's going to take place.
Well, Greg, as always, a wealth of knowledge, and we appreciate you being on. I'm sure there's guys out there right now that have clarified some things that they thought they knew, and now they know for sure. And we do appreciate you being on today.
Great. Good talking to you, Matt.
All right. Talk to you later.
All right. Bye-bye.
All right, guys. That was Greg Grimes sharing a little bit of information with us. If you can take some of the things that he talked to us about and, you know, adapt your fishing styles to that, maybe think about these rivers a little bit more during that fall turnover, you know, where to go and what to do. It'll definitely help us out with our fishing. But thanks again for listening, and we'll talk to you later.